Welcome to APUSH Unit 9 review, and today we'll be covering these topics. So first, we're going to cover the post-World War II period. The big idea is that after World War II, there's going to be a massive economic boom from the 1950s and onwards. The GI Bill of Rights is going to be passed, and this is a critical bill because it gave veterans tuition for schooling and optimal home loans. This is going to allow them to get higher paying jobs, cause the growth of suburbs, and others. Defense spending is going to be a large factor in this economic boom as well. And as we'll see later, there's going to be a massive movement to the suburbs after World War II. We're going to see the rise of the suburbs in the Sun Belt and places like Levittown. There's a massive population boom known as the baby boom. And because of the growth of the suburbs, we're going to see something known as the white flight, where minorities, including African Americans, are going to be left in the urban centers. There's less economic growth because all the middle-class white people are leaving, causing less support for the minorities and ultimately creating more problems. Now, Truman's domestic policies. So while Truman pushed for reforms, many of these are going to be blocked by conservatives in Congress. He creates a Committee on Civil Rights to investigate and advance civil rights, and passes Executive Order 9981, which desegregates the armed forces. So how were his policies blocked? We see this with the Taft-Hartley Act. Despite his veto, the Taft-Hartley Act banned closed shops. A closed shop is where being in a union is a requirement for employment, and this is going to be a big setback for unions. Truman also wants the Fair Deal, which sought to extend the New Deal and its welfare programs like Social Security. However, this was also blocked, except a minimum wage increase from 40 cents an hour to 75 cents an hour. One critical idea is that America is going to become increasingly involved in world affairs during this time period, and is definitely not isolationist. We're going to start to see this with the United Nations. The US is going to join the UN and becomes a member of the permanent UN Security Council. The US also attends the Bretton Woods Conference to establish international finance agreements. The IMF is created, and so is the World Bank. And both of these are going to be intended to promote trade and rebuild after the war. However, the Soviets are going to reject this because, capitalism bad. So the big thing that's going on during this time is the Cold War. The Cold War is going to be a long-lasting ideological, political, and military struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. There's a lot of factors that lead up to this. For one, there's the fundamental conflict between capitalism and communism. And after World War II, the USSR and the US are going to emerge as the dominant powers and are going to start competing with each other for global influence. Recall how there were a lot of tensions at the three conferences as we saw last unit. The Soviets actually leave puppet governments after World War II because they don't pull out their troops. And there's also going to be a lot of rigged elections in Eastern Europe. So the next big idea is that containment is going to be the dominant US foreign policy during the Cold War. Winston Churchill is going to give his Iron Curtain speech, where he says an Iron Curtain has descended over Europe. This symbolized the division between the East and the West, and also called for Western democratic nations to stop Soviet expansion. And in George Kennan's long telegram, Kennan will develop this idea of containment, which was to stop the spread of communism and to contain it to where it already exists. We see this in action with the Truman Doctrine, which gave economic and military aid against communist uprisings, most notably given to Greece and Turkey. There's also the Marshall Plan, which gave billions in aids to any nation that needed it to rebuild. This helps Western Europe recover fast, but the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc are going to reject this. There's also a crisis in Germany. Stalin is going to blockade Berlin and try to force the West out of Berlin. Truman is not going to back down, and instead starts the Berlin airlift with the UK, supplying West Berlin with supplies for 1 year. Stalin eventually gives up and lifts the blockade, but this entire situation is going to symbolize growing tensions. And during the Cold War, there's going to be a massive arms race between the US and the USSR. We're going to see this with the formation of NATO for the West and the Warsaw Pact for the East. The National Security Act is established, creating the DoD, CIA, and the National Security Council. In 1949, the US is going to lose its monopoly on the atomic bomb when the Soviets create and test their first atomic bomb. And there's a secret report called NSC 68, which called for a massive military buildup and will be implemented in the Korean War, as we'll see later. And then in 1952, the US is going to test its first hydrogen bomb, and the Soviets test theirs only 1 year later. Next, the Second Reich Scare symbolized the growing fear and paranoia of the communism in the United States. In 1949, China is going to fall to communism, showing how containment had failed, increasing paranoia. The Smith Act is going to make it illegal to join organizations that advocated for the overthrowing of the government by force. And the Federal Employee Loyalty Program is going to investigate the background of federal employees. The big one is going to be the House of Un-American Activities, which would hunt for communists in American society. A lot of people are going to come before this committee and have their lives ruined. Alger Hiss was a member of the State Department and was accused of being a communist. He will ultimately be jailed for committing perjury. Then in the Rosenberg trial, the Rosenberg couple is going to be convicted of espionage and found guilty of giving top secrets on sonar, radar, and other technology to the USSR. They're going to be executed in 1953. The big idea is that tensions during the Cold War will continue rising as shown by the Korean War. So after World War II, Korea is going to be divided at the 38th parallel. The US occupy the South while the USSR occupy the North. Both are going to withdraw their troops. North Korea then invades South Korea, and then the US is going to back up the UN troops to back up South Korea. And China is going to back up the North Koreans. There's a lot of back and forth, but the war ultimately ends in a stalemate. Truman's going to be criticized for limiting the war because his general actually wanted to invade China. And critics are going to say that Truman was soft on communism. However, this showed that containment worked, and as we see with NSC 68, defense spending is going to skyrocket. Now we're going to cover the Cold War and the civil rights in the 50s. Our next president is going to be Eisenhower. He's a moderate Republican, and his VP is Richard Nixon, a hardcore anti-communist. Eisenhower is political moderate. Yes, he's Republican, but he's going to tolerate New Deal programs. He does pass the Interstate Highway Act, which is the largest public works project, building 42,000 miles of highway. The impact of this is huge. This is going to contribute to a lot of big trends. This project is going to be justified for defense reasons, leads to cultural homogeneity, white flight, and the growth of suburbs. Again, the 1950s was a period of economic prosperity. So here's some big trends that we're going to see. We're going to see the rise of the middle class, the growth of the suburbs like in Levittown and the Sun Belt. We're going to see a big population boom, and we're also going to see a rise in consumerism because of credit cards. And this is similar to what installment plans did in the Roaring 20s. We're also going to see a growing cultural homogeneity because of television. And for complexity, the television does what the radio does in the Roaring 20s. So as you know, every single action has an equal and opposite reaction. The big idea is that while cultural homogeneity increased and was reinforced by television, some will speak out against conformity. For example, television is really going to reinforce this idea of the cult of domesticity. So how do people show nonconformity? You have Betty Friedan, who writes The Feminine Mystique, which questions the role of women in society. There's also rock and roll and Elvis, something that older generations didn't really like. Marilyn Monroe and the Playboy magazine are going to challenge sexual norms, while the beatniks were writers and artists that criticized conformity. For example, you have Allen Ginsberg, who wrote Howl, and Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road. And the civil rights movement is going to be absolutely key in the 1950s. The big idea is that during the 1950s, the civil rights movement is going to be a grassroots movement. This means that it will not be supported by the government just yet. The landmark case that you should know is Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled that separate facilities were inherently unequal. Key to all of this was Thurgood Marshall, an African-American lawyer that will advance many other civil rights cases. This is going to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, but only for schools. However, this will be used to start desegregating other public facilities. While this should have been a massive win for civil rights, change was still slow. However, this slow change is only going to cause more people to rally around the civil rights movement. Okay, so how is change slow? You have the Southern Manifesto, where 101 Southern congressmen denounced the ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education. There's also the Little Rock Nine, where Eisenhower had to send in federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine to Little Rock Central High. Moreover, there's the Montgomery bus boycotts. Rosa Parks' arrest is going to kick off protests of the transportation system, forcing them to desegregate the buses. MLK Jr. is also going to rise to prominence during this time for his nonviolent approach. The SCLC is going to be formed and plays a pivotal role in organizing nonviolent protests. There's also going to be sit-ins, which were nonviolent protests started by students that spread. And the SNCC is formed, which will coordinate and organize more nonviolent protests. Now, the Cold War. We're going to see some people calling for escalation. There's this idea of brinksmanship, where you can't just contain communism, you must fight it. The new look was Eisenhower's foreign policy, which emphasized the buildup of nuclear arms to deter communist aggression. However, mutually assured destruction means that no one is actually going to fire. And ultimately, Eisenhower does not want to escalate the Cold War. He helps negotiate the end of the Korean War with the armistice, and chooses not to back up the Hungarian Revolution against the USSR to prevent another war in Europe. And this is going to lead to the collapse of the revolution. So after Stalin dies, the Cold War kind of thaws for a little. There's Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech, which called for a reduction in nuclear arms. Eisenhower even meets with Soviet leaders, creating the spirit of Geneva. Even though nothing gets done, there's still this idea that the US and the Soviet Union can start working together. The new leader Khrushchev even says that they can have peaceful coexistence with the US. Now, all of this sounds great, but then the Cold War is going to immediately escalate again and expand under Eisenhower. Again, we saw how the Hungarian Revolution was crushed. The launch of Sputnik sparked fears that the US was technologically behind. So the National Defense of Education Act is going to be passed, which would promote STEM education. NASA is going to be formed to develop missiles and rockets, and the space race kicks off. Additionally, a U-2 spy plane is going to be shot down, and a hostage is taken, escalating tensions. Another big idea is that after World War II, the collapse of colonial powers meant that the US and the USSR are going to compete for influence in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. In the Middle East, we're going to see a lot of CIA and covert action. In Operation Ajax, the elected Iranian government is overthrown when they nationalize foreign oil companies. The brutal dictator Shah of Iran is installed, and is definitely not democratic, but hey, great oil prices. In the Suez Crisis, the Suez Canal is going to be nationalized by Egypt, and England, France, and Israel are all going to attack. The US wasn't informed of this beforehand, and Eisenhower demands withdrawal. We're also going to see the Eisenhower Doctrine, which was just the Truman Doctrine before the Middle East. And you should also know OPEC, which was formed in 1960 to control the oil trade. Then in Guatemala, the CIA is going to overthrow another democratically elected government, and a dictator is going to come to power. In Cuba, Fidel Castro removes the dictator from power, but he also nationalizes American businesses, and Eisenhower is going to put an embargo on Cuba. So, Cuba gets closer with the Soviets, and the CIA starts training Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. We'll see how this goes later. As for the legacy of Eisenhower, he's going to warn against the military-industrial complex. The arms race and the defense industry was spending a lot of money, and that could be really bad for American society because you're going to have businesses potentially lobbying the government for war. For sophistication, I will compare Eisenhower's attempts to ease tensions and his expansion in the Cold War. Now we're going to see how these two movements grow in the 1960s. Now, in the election of 1960, Nixon is going to run off against JFK. Their debate is televised, and even though Nixon was a better politician, JFK just looked so much better and wins. His policy was a new frontier, which pushed for education, healthcare, and civil rights, which are all great, except these are pretty much blocked by Congress and the looming threat of the Cold War. So under JFK, the Cold War is going to continue to expand. We're going to see the Bay of Pigs invasion, where JFK approves the CIA plan to train Cuban exiles to start an uprising. This fails horribly, and Cuba is going to get closer to the Soviets. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, U-2 spy planes are going to discover Soviet missiles in Cuba. The US blockades incoming Soviet ships from bringing in more supplies, but no one is going to back down. This is a really tense standoff, and the world is super close to nuclear war. Khrushchev does eventually agree to remove the missiles, but in return, the US must promise not to invade Cuba and had to remove missiles from Turkey. This increase calls for the taunt, or the easing of tensions, and a hotline is created between DC and Moscow. The Cold War is also going to escalate with a flexible response as well. JFK is going to move away from the nuclear buildup of the new look because you can't use nukes in conflicts, and instead is going to increase the arms race by spending more on conventional weapons. So we're going to see a rise in defense spending despite warnings of the military-industrial complex. You should also know that the Berlin Wall is going to be constructed in 1961, separating East and West Berlin. JFK is unfortunately assassinated, and his Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ, becomes the president. LBJ is a New Deal Democrat and wants to expand New Deal reforms, which would require an increase in government size and power. His domestic policy is known as the Great Society, and this will push for civil rights unlike the New Deal. Major reforms will also include immigration, civil rights, education, and healthcare. We're actually going to cover the Great Society in some more detail. The big idea is that LBJ's Great Society created many reforms and a welfare state, but also greatly increased government power and scope. LBJ is going to declare a war on poverty. He creates the Office of Economic Opportunity, which created the Head Start program and the Job Corps. This also promoted literacy programs. LBJ reforms immigration with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which ends the Quota Acts. This causes a skyrocket in immigration from Latin America, Asia, and other countries. He also establishes Medicare, which is healthcare for the old, and Medicaid, which is healthcare for the poor and disabled. Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring is also going to increase awareness of pollution, and the Clean Air Act of 1963 and the Water Quality Act of 1965 will be passed. So, LBJ is going to reform a lot thanks to the Democrat majority in Congress. However, critics said that the Great Society was too costly, inefficient, and created dependency. Keep this in mind because we're going to see a massive conservative backlash later. We're going to go back to civil rights. So JFK is going to do nothing for civil rights, so the grassroots movement is going to continue to put pressure for action. We're going to see the freedom rides, where black and white activists rode on buses throughout the South to protest segregation. They're going to face a lot of violence. MLK also writes his letter from a Birmingham jail, which is really powerful and continues to rally people around the civil rights movement. There's also the famous March on Washington, where 200,000 people gather to hear King's famous I Have a Dream speech. And we're just going to see the civil rights movement getting bigger and bigger. However, under LBJ, the federal government is also going to advocate for civil rights. The 24th Amendment is passed, banning poll taxes. There's also the Freedom Summer, which is the voter registration drive in Mississippi. In the march from Selma to Montgomery, LBJ is going to send in troops to protect the nonviolent protesters. And the two big bills are going to be the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, which banned federal discrimination based on race, color, sex, and religion, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited racial discrimination when voting. It's important to note that the civil rights movement does change. After 1965, the civil rights movement for African Americans radicalizes. They're going to stray away from just using nonviolence and no longer seeks just integration. We're going to see the Watts riots after the arrest of a black motorist by white officers. One key figure is Malcolm X, who advocated for self-sufficiency, black nationalism, separatism, and opposed the nonviolent ways of MLK. He was much more militant. We also see the rise of black power, which called for economic empowerment and separatism. For example, the Black Panther Party was formed and was very militant. They believed in using black violence to counteract white violence, while also stressed taking care of each other. Additionally, the civil rights movement is also going to expand after 1965 to include more minorities. The National Organization for Women is going to be founded by Betty Friedan and a campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment. This amendment sought to codify laws that prohibited discrimination based on sex. However, this is going to be shot down by Phyllis Schlafly in a conservative backlash. We're also going to see the Stonewall riots, which sparks the gay rights movement. Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers are going to demand better wages and working conditions for migrant farm workers. We're also going to see the passage of the Self-Determination Act of 1975, which gave Native Americans greater control of their land, education, and others. Now, the Vietnam War. The US is going to become increasingly involved in Vietnam over many presidents. Again, it's the same story. We're going to see the communist North versus the non-communist South. Under Eisenhower, the US is going to back the unpopular South Vietnam leader, Diem. JFK is going to send in military advisors to help out against the Viet Cong. The big one, though, is going to be the Gulf of Tonkin incident under LBJ, where a US ship was allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese torpedoes. This causes Congress to issue the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which essentially gave LBJ a blank check for Vietnam. Now, ground troops are going to start pouring into Vietnam to fight. So the government is going to keep sending in troops, and says the war is going great. But in the Tet Offensive, the public finds that the war was going terribly and would not be over anytime soon. The government had lied, and this is going to cause anti-war protests to flare. Finally, we're going to see how these two movements accumulate in the 70s. Now, Nixon. The big idea is that Nixon is going to win the election in 1968 as Americans rejected New Deal liberalism and wanted more conservatism. Really, the big thing with Nixon is Vietnam. He promises peace with honor, which would end the war with honor. And he propagated this idea of the silent majority, which claimed that the majority of Americans supported the war and didn't protest. The next big idea is that anti-war protests are going to flare as the Vietnam War rages on. We're going to see the UCB free speech movement, which protested against the restriction of protests by Berkeley. SDS will be formed, issuing the Port Huron statement, denouncing Vietnam, racism, and other things. We've already seen how news of the Tet Offensive sparked anti-war protests. News of the My Lai massacre, where unarmed civilians were murdered by the US, will reach the United States public and is going to cause outrage. And all of this anti-war sentiment is going to force Nixon to backtrack a little with the Nixon Doctrine, stating that the US would honor its commitments, but Asian countries cannot rely on US troops forever. The next big idea is that while Nixon publicly tried to end the war, he secretly expands it. Nixon advocated for Vietnamization, where US troops would slowly pull out. But he also started the secret bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. This is going to spark a lot of outrage. In fact, 4 are killed at the Kent State shootings. Kissinger is also going to start secret negotiations, and when these stall, Nixon just bombs North Vietnam. The next big idea is that anti-war sentiment and distrust will only continue to grow as Vietnam rages on. Daniel Ellsberg leaks the Pentagon Papers, which show that the US government from JFK and onwards lied to the American public about Vietnam. And this is going to spark a lot of outrage. Congress ends up passing the War Powers Act to reduce the war power of the president. This act stated that Congress must be informed 48 hours ahead of time before troops are sent, and that Congress must approve any military mission longer than 60 days. The Vietnam War finally ends with the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. US troops will be pulled out, and free elections were supposed to take place. However, the fighting continues, and Vietnam ultimately becomes communist. And generally speaking, the Vietnam War is going to be seen as a failure. The next big idea is that Nixon does pursue a policy of détente with the USSR and other communist nations. Nixon is going to take advantage of the Sino-Soviet split between the USSR and China. He visits China in 1972 to talk with Mao, and even before this, we see ping-pong diplomacy that really softened tensions. There's also the SALT treaties with the USSR, showing Nixon's success with détente. The big thing with Nixon, though, is going to be the Watergate scandal. Creep will be caught breaking into the Democrat HQ in Watergate to steal secret files and election plans. Even before this, Nixon's people were up to some questionable things. Nixon ordered wiretaps, had these so-called plumbers to stop leaks in the press, and weaponized the IRS against his opponents. Nixon is going to deny responsibility of the Watergate scandal, but an investigation shows that he was involved. A massive scandal erupts. There's an impeachment trial, but Nixon resigns before he is impeached. Ultimately, Watergate is going to show the decreasing trust in government. Now we're going to cover the conflict in the Middle East. In the 1970s, we're going to see a lot of stagflation, which is just inflation with economic stagnation. In the Yom Kippur War, Syria and Egypt are going to attack Israel. The US supports Israel, so OPEC is going to impose an embargo, worsening stagflation. Eventually, the Camp David Accords are signed. Jimmy Carter helps negotiate a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. In the Iranian hostage crisis, American diplomats and citizens are going to be held hostage for 444 days after the US-backed Shah of Iran is overthrown. This will strain US-Iran relations for decades to come. Now we're going to close out the 70s with some civil rights developments. Title IX is passed by Congress, which sought to end sex discrimination in schools. Roe v. Wade legalized abortion, and you should know that this was overturned in 2022. The ERA is going to be struck down by Phyllis Schlafly, a big-time conservative. Affirmative action is upheld by the University of California versus Bach. Another big idea is the Warren Court is going to expand rights and freedoms under the Chief Justice Earl Warren. There's a lot of important cases, but you don't need to know all of them. One example is going to be Miranda versus Arizona, which establishes the Miranda rights. Now we're going to cover the new right and modern America. Keep in mind that you're only going to have a few questions on this on the MCQ. It is highly unlikely you get a prompt on the 1980s on your DBQ. Remember that on the LEQ you can choose between 3 questions, and only the last one will cover the 1980s. So this entire section is technically optional. The big idea is that the rise of the new right is going to be a counter-reaction to the new liberal movements of the post-war American society, such as the increasing welfare state, New Deal liberalism, civil rights, the sexual revolution, abortion, and others. The new right believe that these liberal movements undermine traditional values and national security. We're going to see the rise of movements like the moral majority, the intertwining of religion and conservatives on the right. Many of these are religious fundamentalists. Again, they're going to be anti-abortion, favor creationism being taught in school, and others. The next big idea is the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 is going to mark a major milestone for the new right. Again, Reagan is going to be opposed to a large government and is against the welfare state and other liberal programs. However, Social Security and Medicare remain. He also pushes this idea of Reaganomics, which is just trickle-down economics that favored the wealthy. This included tax cuts for the wealthy and businesses, the deregulation of industry, and you should also know that union membership will be down during this time. There's also an increase in the federal budget deficit. Reagan is going to cut welfare spending, but then massively increase defense spending, and also got less revenue because of tax cuts. Now we're going to cover Reagan's foreign policy. So under Reagan, the US is going to oppose communism, generally increasing Cold War tensions. Reagan will most definitely pursue military interventions. Sure, they were smaller in scope than Vietnam, but they were strategic. We're going to see this in Grenada and the Iran-Contra affair later. Military spending is also going to skyrocket. Reagan proposes SDI, where we would have lasers in space to shoot down missiles. This never came to fruition, but was pursued nonetheless. You should also know that Reagan will pursue détente with the USSR. He is actually going to strengthen diplomatic relations with Gorbachev. So it's kind of mixed. On one hand, Reagan increases Cold War tensions, but he also does work to relieve it. Now we're going to cover the Iran-Contra affair and Grenada. So in the US invasion of Grenada, an anti-American and socialist regime is going to come into power after a coup. So Reagan is going to send in the Marines to return the pro-United States government back to power. Then in Nicaragua, Marxist Sandinistas will revolt against the pro-US dictatorship known as the Contras. The US will obviously send military aid to the Contras. Congress is going to pass the Boland Amendment, which prohibited further aid to the Contras. However, in the Iran-Contra affair, it was discovered that arms sales proceedings to Iran were used to fund the Contras, and this really embarrassed the administration. The next big idea is that while the Cold War tensions increase with Reagan, diplomatic relations with the USSR will be better. Gorbachev is going to implement some reforms as the Soviet economy tanks. We're going to see glasnost, or political freedom, and perestroika, which was limited capitalist reforms. Soviet troops are going to pull out of the Eastern Bloc, and this will spark many independence movements. There's also going to be a lot of arms control agreements between the US and the USSR. For example, the INF Treaty will be signed in 1987. The Berlin Wall will fall in 1989, and 2 years later, the Soviet Union dissolves. And this is going to force the United States to redefine its role in the world as a leading superpower. So some things you should know about the Bush administration. He's going to be elected in 1988. And under Bush, the US is going to be involved in the Persian Gulf War with Operation Desert Storm. Basically, Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invades Kuwait, and the US troops are going to lead a coalition to liberate Kuwait. Another big idea is that in contrast to the Warren Court, the Supreme Court decisions under Reagan and Bush will be much more conservative. For example, Sandra Day O'Connor will be the first woman in the Supreme Court. She was a moderate conservative and was considered a swing vote. You also have Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where the Supreme Court ruled that states can put restrictions on abortion. Finally, we're going to cover modern America, starting with technology. The big idea is the digital revolution is going to redefine America socially, economically, and politically. The digital revolution is going to start in the 1980s. I want to see the rise of the information age with the internet. We're going to see computers and smartphones, the dot-com boom, the rise of e-commerce with Amazon and eBay. We're also going to see the rise of social media with Instagram and YouTube. Tech jobs are going to be created in Silicon Valley. And political impacts include the Joe Rogan podcast and the rise of political memes. Next, let's cover immigration. So for context, we recall the rise of the Sun Belt and the Immigration Reform Act in 1965, which removed quotas for immigrants. The big idea is that as a result of globalization, the rise of the Sun Belt, a booming economy, labor shortages, and others, immigrants are going to come to the United States in large numbers. These immigrants are going to be primarily from Latin America and East Asia, with very few coming over from Europe. One act that you should know is the proposed DREAM Act of 2010, which would have given citizenship to undocumented minors. However, Republicans oppose this in Congress. Now we're also going to talk about the economy. We're going to see the rise of globalization during this time, which is the flow of people, capital, and goods across the world. We're going to see the rise of multinational corporations. We're also going to see NAFTA passed and the World Trade Organization being established. Finally, we will end with conflicts in modern America. In the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the terrorist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 planes. 2 of them will hit the World Trade Center, 1 hits the Pentagon, and 1 is down thanks to the passengers resisting. In response, Congress passes the Patriot Act, which expanded government surveillance. George W. Bush is going to declare a war on terrorism, and the US is going to invade Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban and kill Osama bin Laden. That is all for APUSH Unit 9 review. If this video was helpful, then please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing the video. Thank you for watching.